Welcome everyone to this evening's webinar. It's my pleasure to introduce our webinar tonight titled Animal Health Management, How Partnerships Can Solve Big Problems. My name is Jay Parsons. I'm a professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics and the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I'm pleased to be joined this evening by a number of different presenters and also Dr. Jim Logan, who's going to MC our program tonight. Dr. Logan is one of the co-chairs of the ASI Animal Health Committee, and in a moment I'm going to turn it over to him to provide a brief introduction to the webinar and turn it over to our speakers from there. So let me start by saying this evening's webinar is brought to you by the American Sheep Industry Association and made possible with funding support from the USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS as we call them. We want to thank them for their support. We also want to encourage you to visit the ASI website to learn more about how to be successful in the sheep business. Their URL is www.sheepusa.org. If you're not currently a member of the American Sheep Industry Association, I encourage you to join it. Most people do that by joining their state association. If you're wondering how to get in contact with those people, there's a list of contact people for all the associations on the ASI website under the contacts link. I'd like to remind everybody that this webinar is being recorded. Everybody that registered for it will receive a follow-up email within 48 hours after the webinar with a link to the webinar recording, and those will also be posted up on the ASI website. We're scheduled for about 90 minutes total tonight. We're planning on having some time at the end for some questions, but you don't have to wait till then to submit them. There's a question box on your control panel. Feel free to type questions into that at any time during the webinar, and we'll keep an eye on those and try to answer as many of those as we can with the time that we have available. So with that, we got a full agenda, so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Logan for his introductory remarks. And while he is doing that, we'll go ahead and get our first presenter slides up and be ready to roll from there. So Dr. Logan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jay. We appreciate your being the moderator for this. And I want to thank Amy Hendrickson with ASI staff and Dr. Detweiler for kind of conceiving the notion for this webinar and all of our presenters. And as we go through tonight, we'll begin with a few short presentations from Dr. Detweiler. Will lead off, and she will kind of introduce herself, and then we'll have Dr. Paul Rogers, who was previously with ASI for a number of years as a policy staff director. I'll participate in some of the discussion there, and then we'll go to Dr. Diane Sutton, and then we'll go to a producer who has some firsthand experience with scrapie, Eric Mrozinski, and then we'll kind of finish off the presentation part of it with Dr. Stephanie Ringler from USDA APHIS. And I think probably best if each of the speakers kind of does a little short self-introduction. That way I don't botch something in the process or forget to say something that I should or shouldn't. So on behalf of Dr. Wolf, who is unable to be with us this evening, and myself, I want to welcome everybody to the webinar. And I believe, Dr. Detweiler, if you are ready, it looks like your slides are up. If you'll go ahead and take off with it.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Logan. I appreciate the opportunity and thank the American Sheep Industry for asking me to participate in this very important webinar. So I'm going to kick things off today and talk about scrapie in the United States. And I have actually the beginning of the story. So just a little bit about myself. I grew up on a pig farm in New Jersey, and I have a bachelor's from dairy science from Delaware Valley Nowta University in Pennsylvania, my DVM from Ohio State. I was in private food animal practice in Ohio, and then went to work for USDA APHIS VS as a field VMO in Ohio. And this is really where I got involved with scrapie. At that time, Ohio had the highest number of cases of scrapie in the country. And this was in, I'm really dating myself, in the mid-1980s. Then I was a senior staff veterinarian, first for scrapie the national coordinator, and then moved over to coordinate the TSE, the Transmissible Spongiform Encephalopathy Working Group. I took a little break from the government, was a veterinary consultant, and actually returned now, and I'm on the small ruminant staff. And I raised Suffolk sheep in Muslim Township, New Jersey, and those pictures to the side are some of my flock. So basically, I'm going to tell you a story today, or we're going to tell you a combined story today. And it's going to be the story of Scrapie in the US from the first confirmed introduction to the present day. And it's really a success story. And that's the success story is thanks to the cooperation between the government, the state and federal government, and industry partners. When I first started, and you'll see, where we've come from, going back a ways. If you had told me we'd be here and very close to the end goal of the eradication of Scrapie, I would have not believed it. So again, it's really a success story, and hopefully throughout tonight you'll see that. So we start this story with the movement of purebred sheep from the United Kingdom to Canada. And that was Scrapie was first moved, purebred sheep, namely Suffolks, from the UK to Canada, and it was first detected in Canada in 1938. So that starts our story. And then in the US, we first reported our first case was diagnosed in a Michigan flock, and that was 1947. And that was through the import of British origin sheep from Canada. And the disease was not reported again in the United States until 1952. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But you can see this slide here, and that's from an old publication in the 1960s. And you can see here the movement from Great Britain into Canada, and then Canada into the United States for several introductions. And so the early days, 1947 to 1958, you can see the movement into the West Coast and really into the Midwest with Indiana, multiple cases, Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, etc. So the response to that, there was not a real big response in 1947. That was pretty much contained. But in 1952, in California, there were 2 associated flocks. And in those flocks, there were 21 sheep showing signs of Scrapie. So the California Wool Growers, the California Department of Agriculture, the National Wool Growers Association, the U.S. Livestock Sanitary Association urged the USDA to take immediate action. And so in response to that, the USDA, the Secretary of Agriculture, declared an emergency. And this was in the end of October 1952. And again, that was driven by the increased prevalence of the disease, primarily in California, but in some other states. And Title IX of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 78, it was declared Scrapie in sheep, and it provided the department the authority to quarantine and have regulations that restricted the interstate transportation of the sheep because of Scrapie. So this was the first appearance of Scrapie within the Code of Federal Regulations. And under this authority, actually entire counties could be quarantined, and that happened in several states. And in looking at the story, and I got this from some publications that were done by the folks that were living this at that time, in California, they stomped out everything, and they actually were quite successful. But you can see that it did spread throughout there, and there was this increase in the 50s, etc. So the state of emergency continued for some time, for 2 years, and then in December of 1954, the emergency order was terminated. Scrapie had been spread quite a bit, and it became a regular part of the disease control program. And that was under Part 54, which we still have authority under that part in the 9 CFR today. And then sheep destroyed because of Scrapie was added to the CFR on a permanent basis. There was this time then, there was the cooperative program was established, and that was between the federal, state, and the industry. And at that time, the program consisted of laboratory confirmation of clinical Scrapie, the quarantine and slaughter of all animals in the infected flock, the tracing and slaughter of exposed animals and their progeny. And at that time, indemnity was paid. There were $25 for grades and $75 per registered animals. This also in 54, the emergency order didn't include goats, but when the order was rescinded, the cooperative program included goats. And then in 1957, the depopulation of source flocks, actions against source flocks were included. And the definition at that time of source flocks was any flock where an infected animal was removed within the previous 18 months, and they were also depopulated. I put that stool to the right. It's a three-legged stool. And I think throughout, you'll see throughout these years, the cooperative programs, the three-legged stool, it really depends on every leg of that stool, the federal government, the state government, and the industry. If you take a leg away from a three-leg stool, it can't stand. And again, that's the really important part of the Scrapie program, that this program where we work together in the partnership. One other thing I'll add, that during the 50s and 60s, there was a bloodline option offered if there was only one bloodline affected. But mostly it was a total flock depopulation, and that continued through the 70s and into the early 80s. So the science of the time, the big argument, and there was a meeting, and I have the book here, and I actually have a copy of this book. It was a Scrapie seminar that was held in Washington, D.C., and it brought together the people that were working on the research, not only in the United States, but in the United Kingdom. And there were a fair amount of people in the UK that were working on the science. And there was a big argument. And if you read the transcripts in that book from there, you could tell people, they were really losing their tempers over this argument. So this researcher, H.B. Parry, he was arguing that it was an autosomal recessive gene. And then W.S. Gordon was doing some research with live animals, with live sheep, and he was like he said it's a transmissible agent. But again, we're talking the 60s, so no one had identified the agent at this time. So there was a lot of different theories. There was a virus, although it was really not typical, right? It withstood boiling, it withstood high concentrations of formalin. So it was like no virus that they had seen at that time. Another theory was it was a virino, which is part virus and with some nucleic acid, etc., a spiroplasma. So there were a number of different theories that were floated out at that time. But again, Gordon was arguing transmissible, and Parry was arguing pure genetic disease. And this continued for quite a while. In fact, a little bit of personal history with me. This debate even continued up into the 80s, and that's where I came into the picture. And ASI had asked, and Paul Rogers is on the call, had asked me to write a paper on Scrapie for the industry to sum up all the things that we knew about it. And then they also asked me to have Dr. Stanley Prusiner, who was working on the disease at this time. He's at the University of San Francisco in California. He went on to win the Nobel Prize, but he was an up-and-coming researcher for his prion theory, which we'll talk a little bit about coming up, and to ask and to him to review it. Well, I got that paper back and had a big red marker on it saying trash. I wish I still had a copy of it, but it was trash. This is trash all across the top. And most of it was, because I ran into him, was the fact that I had written that it was a transmissible disease in sheep. And when I actually ran into him, I asked him about why he wrote trash, and he said because it was genetic, and he worked with it in hamsters and mice, and I said I worked with it in sheep, and it spread between flocks. So that was kind of the deal. All right. So now we're going to get into, that was all I got from books and the written history of that. And Jim Horgan wrote a lot of that. Wilbur Clark were working on that at the time. And so this is kind of where I come into the picture, was in the 1980s. And so we went to a bloodline surveillance program. And that really was because the industry, the total flock depopulation was taking these really important genetic lines. People, it kind of drove the disease underground. There wasn't a lot of money for the disease. So it was thought that, hey, there is something connected with certain bloodlines. So we went to a bloodline program. It was actually in 1983. And it was to reduce indemnity and preserve the valuable bloodlines. And in that program, if an infected animal was confirmed in a flock, then the maternal lines were depopulated, the dam, grand dam, offspring, and then the flock was monitored for 42 months. So this again shifted the emphasis away from total flock to population. The problem with this was that it wasn't just a genetic disease, and so the industry became frustrated. The regulators became frustrated with this. Also, we did allow for total flock if you had multiple bloodlines, but usually we ran out of money. So it was just frustrating all around. And again, I worked in the field in Ohio with a number of different flocks, and it just was very difficult at that time. The other thing that made our jobs very difficult was we had very limited diagnostic tools and a still limited understanding about the disease. So our basic diagnostic tools we had at that time were histopathology, okay, and just looking under a microscope at the brain tissue. And we had to have 4 lesions criteria. Again, the government didn't want to be taking your flock or taking your sheep unless we knew for sure. So it was decided that in order to confirm scrapie, we needed 4 lesions found by histopathology, by looking under the microscope. And a lot of times, and we know this now, there's certain, breeds, et cetera, that might not show lesions. They're part of the disease, even if it's clinical, that you might not see all these lesions. I mean, the typical is the neuronal vascularization, neuronal degeneration, astrocytosis, et cetera. But a lot of times you'd have a clinical animal in a flock that had other animals, and you would get not a diagnosis. You wouldn't get all 4 lesions. So again, very frustrating. The other really frustrating thing especially for the producers, that if the brain was frozen or if it was autolyzed, if it was hot and it started to deteriorate, histopathology, you really couldn't complete the histopathology. So we had the mouse bioassay system where they take the brain and they would put it into a panel of mice, but you take and wait for them to come down with scrapie if the sheep was infected. But that took up to 2 years. So you could see how frustrating it was. We tell the producer, we'll come back in 2 years and tell you if you had the disease in your flock. So again, a lot of frustration all around. We had no live animal tests. We had no tests that could find the disease before they showed signs. So given this, again, frustration all around, in 1987 and 88, the USDA, we had a series of meetings, and just in the middle here is the Federal Register notice that invited the public. And so there was a series of meetings where we invited researchers, the ones that were working in the United States, but in other countries, in industry, the state, federal government, to come together and to say, hey, do we have enough? What are we doing? What do we need? Where direction should we be going with the program? So the cause of the disease, the science, basically, the summary was the cause of the disease was not really known at that time. The natural modes of transmission were poorly understood. If subtle or no clinical signs present until later in the production life. So we did seem to know that once the animal became infected, usually young, they wouldn't show signs for 3 and 4 years. And it was suspected that they were shedding the agent to cause infection when they weren't sick, and so when they were moving. But again, it wasn't really proven at that time. There was no reliable live animal or preclinical diagnostic tests. The postmortem, as I explained, diagnostic tests were really unreliable for detecting the disease. I mean, when you had all 4 lesions, you knew you had it, but we were missing cases. And then we had a poor understanding of environmental factors that may contribute to the disease spread. Other factors were not, no identification requirements. So that limited our traceability. And it was a reluctance by producers, to report clinical suspects because of the policies that were in place. So again, you had all these things ongoing. So we had these meetings. And because of the meetings and because of the findings, we actually had on November 2nd, 1988, where there was an advance notice of proposed rulemaking on the scrapie program. And that really was asking the public, asking the industry, with solicited comments on whether we should discontinue having any kind of program for scrapie eradication. So basically the comments from that 1988 ANPR, the advance notice, that we had 145 comments that were received. 134 of those comments said the program should be continued and enhanced or revised and strengthened. And the majority of them said eradication of scrapie should be the goal of the program. So the commenters requested that there should be additional research, especially for diagnostics and the understanding of transmission, that was really crucial for the government to put that. And the industry was really supportive of that. Additional education and information disseminated to the industry, that there should be uniformity between states. And there was at that time some states, quarantined, some did not. I mean, so there was a lot of differences between how the states enforce the program. The permanent identification was really important, a fair indemnity, and then industry involvement and input into what we were doing. So those were the comments from 1988. Okay, so then it was decided, okay, since we had the majority of comments on there, that we would have a program, negotiated rulemaking it's called, and the government can do this on very special things, where we would bring together those parties with a vested interest to develop a program in response to the problem. So that was put together, and you can see here all the members of that, the American Association of Ruminant Practitioners, Farm Bureau, and then multiple of the breeds. Again, Hamps, the Polypays, the Suffolk, both Suffolk, there were two at that time, the American Suffolk Society and the National Suffolk Sheep Association, the National Assembly, which is the state veterinarians, the Dorsets, ourselves, and United States Animal Health Association. So again, all the entities with an interest. And you might say, well, what the heck, the national renders, what's their interest? So I'm going to get to that right now. So during that same time, and the UK first reported in BSE in 1986, and this it became like a big impact on the whole process, because the first theory for BSE was that it was scrapie in sheep that was made into a meat and bone meal and fed back to cattle that actually caused the disease and was responsible. So you can see how we're thinking about what to do with scrapie, and then we have to worry about BSE. And at that time, in the late 80s, we had just started surveillance, and we didn't know, do we have it in the United States or not? So I'm going to ask Paul Rogers, who he and I kind of lived through some of these wars and the negotiated rulemaking, et cetera, but even all the earlier things. And Paul was with the American sheep industry to kind of tell the story. I think it's better coming from the industry about what happened with BSE and some of our members of the negotiated rulemaking. Paul, if you want to jump in here. I know, can Paul get on, or?
Paul said he was on, Linda, but I don't know if he may be muted.
Okay.
Let's give him a second to.
Okay, you bet.
Yeah, Paul, I unmuted you. Can you? I don't know if his microphone is working.
Okay. Rather than hold
Jim,
up. Oh,
Jim
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Jim might be able to add a little bit. I don't know.
I can tell
Well,
the story. Paul and I discussed it,
yeah.
but Jim, if you want to tell the story, go ahead.
I can't tell the story as well as Paul or you, Linda. So if Paul can get on, that's fine. But why don't you go ahead so we don't hold things up? Go ahead and
Okay.
start. And if Paul can get on, he'll break in there.
Okay, very good. So it was very nervous. In 1988, the United Kingdom made a ban for the feeding of ruminant protein, to ruminants, etc. And so there was really worry in the U.S., well, the renders in the feed industry, the cattle industry, etc., about, what to do and were they going to have a ban here, etc. And so it was real easy to probably point the finger to sheep, and we now know that that's probably not the right story at all. But the renderers and the feed actually asked the sheep industry, American sheep industry, asked Paul, how much is the sheep industry worth in the US? And they were serious. They gave a figure and they said, let's just pay and kill every sheep and goat in the country and bury it, and then we don't have to worry about it. And that's a true story, and they were dead serious, because if you look at the alternative and the potential cost, that's where they were going with this. So that was quite dramatic. And this really put a lot of pressure and on the negotiated rulemaking. So it threw this extra little wrench into the whole negotiated rulemaking. So there was kind of like almost a, an anvil hanging over the head to really get something done. Did Paul ever join, or he can tell it really good, but so he's the one that had to answer to that. Okay, so we'll go on here. So the outcome of the negotiated rulemaking, it took well over a year. It was really intense in this, and to try and come up with a solution that would work for the sheep industry, okay? But we came up with regulations which established identification of sheep from scrapie infected and scrapie source flocks, a one-time indemnification. So we raised the indemnity to try and find any infected and source flocks, and then established a voluntary scrapie flock certification program. And I will just tell you, this was an important thing, this last thing, because there was no live animal test, preclinical test, it was very difficult for producers that had scrapie and wanted to stay in certain breeds to find sources that were free. Okay, and I have to say, and Paul, if you could speak in, would jump in, at that time, predominantly was in the black-faced breeds, okay? Suffolk Associated.
I just got on, Linda.
Okay. Oh, yeah,
Sorry
Paul,
about that.
No, that's okay. What else do you want to add on any of this on there?
Oh, just that little story. Excuse me. I think it was 96. I think you told me I couldn't remember. But anyway, we were at USAHA, and these two British guys grabbed us up and took us to a dark room in the back of the hotel, wherever it was we were. There may have been someone else there. I can't remember, but it was really weird. And they told us that they had scrapie and cattle. And I know you remember that.
Yep, I do.
Yeah. that was quite an evening. Wasn't what I had planned. I was ready to go to cocktails, but that started a whole new thing. And well, it went on from there. And you've told the story very well. And excellent job, because we were in that for, well, we're still in it, but it's been a long road. But that changed the game altogether. It wasn't just sheep. And as we all know, there's not as many sheep in the United States and weren't then as there are in Great Britain and surrounding countries in Europe, and you got Canada. So it was a game changer. It truly was. So we went to work and then went into negotiated rulemaking and eventually and figured out how to do it. But I appreciate everything you said, because we were in whole flock populations, and then we had to move to a little different place because of funding. And I was off for a little bit. Did you cover the 201 trade case dollars?
No, when I'm done, Paul, we'd like you to get into that yet. Yeah, that's okay.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
No, you go ahead.
Well, yeah, anything you want to jump in, yeah, that comes a little bit later, but yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
All
right.
So the scrapie certification program was really important for folks that were looking to buy from flocks that had some history and some proven that they didn't have scrapie. And that's really one of the reasons why that was put into place. And we use it now really for trade, and Dr. Sutton will talk about that. But so those were the three kind of tiers that came out of that negotiated rulemaking on there. The other thing that was happening, that there was now money. The one good thing, if you can say it, with about BSE, mad cow disease, is that it drove funding, because we see through these cycles, and not only in the UK, but in the US, we saw these cycles where if there was emphasis off like on scrapie, then the funding went down. And that's what happened in a number of countries where the funding went down for research. But BSE and the worry about jumping a species, it was reported in cats in 1990, again, while we're doing this. So there was a lot of attention on the TSEs at that time. And so it really was helpful to fund the research. So a couple of really key things happened. To the left is the structure, the prion protein, right? We have the normal protein the sheep do in their body, and then something causes it to change to the abnormal form. So these alpha helixes here to beta sheets, and the beta sheet protein is really resistant, and that's what makes it resistant to, most disinfectants that take care of most viruses. And that Stan Brusner reported, Paul Benheim and David Bolton reported that in 1982. But again, people thought he was a kook. Stan Brusner was roasted for a while on that, on the prion theory. And then the other thing, given now that they could find this abnormal form of the prion protein, led to other diagnostics. And one real crucial was immunohistochemistry, which is a picture in the middle there. And that led to being able to find the prion protein in the lymphoreticular system. So you could find it in other tissues other than the brain, which then later you'll see leads to a preclinical test. And then Western blot, and the Western blot, literally, I know Dr. Sutton had some experience where you could literally pour the brain out in liquid form out of a skull, because they did some work down in Mission, and that still would come out and be a robust test. So it gave us tests that we could do, like even if the brain was autolyzed or frozen, etc., they were much more robust, and they were really, really crucial in helping us. And it picked up many more cases than we were losing with histopathology. So let's go back to we talked about this whole thing about if it was transmissible or a genetic disease. Well, it turned out actually it was a combination. Scrapie is an infectious, it's a transmissible disease with a genetic influence, okay? And the transmissible part, there's infectivity in the placenta, birth fluids, colostrum, milk, etc. Those are the most secretions, excretions, etc. Where it's shed into the environment. Usually it's an oral uptake. Transmission usually occurs at or near birth, with the average of 3 to 4 years of the incubation until the animal develops clinical signs. And once clinically ill, it's always fatal. So that's the transmissibility part. The other thing that was found, that was Stan Brusner found this the prion protein gene. And then in 1994, Dave Westaway, he was at Stan Brusner's lab, discovered this codon 171. And I'm sure the producers, that codon. And he found that glutamine, so the Q at 171 renders the sheep susceptible to scrapie, and the arginine rendered resistant. So this was one of the real early papers for this, and it turned out to be real. So this one, when I was in the field, we collected a lot of samples. I was collecting, you name it, lymph nodes, cerebral spinal fluid, you name it, from a lot of sheep and whatnot in these infected flocks. So that led to sending it to researchers to help us, to help them to advance their work. So this is one of the papers that came out of that. And then the genotypes, again, I think everybody's familiar, but you can see that 136 is another important codon. So alanine, AARR sheep have the most resistance to scrapie, and then the AAQQ are highly susceptible. So those came out of this early work, which again prove, you'll see when Dr. Sutton talks, how crucial these findings for us. And then again, the discovery of the prion protein in the lymphoreticular system led to the development of live animal tests. So the rectal biopsy, mucosa, and the third eyelid test. And the rectal mucosa biopsy has over 85% sensitivity. So again, all these were crucial breakthroughs for having us make progress in the scrapie program. So we're pretty much to the end of my story here with the Scrapie program and lead off the beginning, and we'll have our next speakers to talk a little bit more. But before I close, I just want to thank and dedicate this presentation to those responsible for TSC scientific advancements, especially in the early years, where they really didn't have a lot to work with. And so this is a list, and there were many others when I was writing this list together, but I was fortunate to know a number of these folks and work with them, and really appreciate a lot of them are no longer with us. Also, I want to thank the my state and federal colleagues who worked to carry out this, the surveillance and the program. It wasn't always easy. And then lastly, which I think is really crucial again for this partnership, I want to dedicate this to the producers who suffered these losses. And it was, I mean, I was in the days of total flock, you know, et cetera, the populations. I did depopulated too many sheep that I would care for. I mean, that was just heartbreaking to the producers, et cetera. But those who suffered these losses but still allowed us, they provided the sheep and the tissues for the advancement of science. And so I put some papers here that wouldn't have happened without these producers being willing to allow us to take samples, to take their sheep and do research. So that's my part of the story, and I'll kick it over to somebody else here.
Linda, I'll go ahead and take it back for just a second. Dr. Rogers, do you have more that you want to bring up related to this part of the discussion?
Oh, about all I could do, Jim, is tell stories about it, but it was a long, arduous, difficult process. But we knew we needed to do it. We need to get this done. I've got an echo. I hope y'all don't. But the feed ban was important, and the negotiated rulemaking process was something I'd never been through ever, and we learned a lot about each other and the organizations that were represented there. And later on, when we did the trade case in 2000, 2001, had provided some funding for this program that was very much underfunded. Really helped. So that's all I've got to add right now.
Okay, Paul, thank you. And I think I agree with you that it was an arduous process for the negotiated rulemaking, and we all learned a lot, I think, through that. A lot of us, it was the first time we'd ever actually had to be through that type of a thing. But I think one of the most important parts of it is that there were a lot of very long lasting, in fact, lasting even clear to now, relationships that were developed through those processes. And I don't know that either Linda or Paul completely brought it up, but there were a lot of knockdown dragouts in the early days of this. But there were also many very good relationships that were developed and nurtured that led to the success of the program. And I think Linda very well brought it up that there was a lot of collaboration over the years between the industry and the facets of government and producers, everybody. And had there not been the willingness and the desire to collaborate and cooperate with each other, in spite of the drawbacks of some of the things in the early days, we never would have got to where we are now. And Linda alluded to the fact that she was in it back in the days when whole herd or whole flock depopulation had to be done. I was there too, both as a practitioner and then as a regulator, where we had to completely depopulate flocks. And I believe Diane's going to talk a little bit about the changes, the turnaround in the rules and the progress that was made with the advent of the domestic or of the genetics testing capabilities and then the live animal tests. So with that, Dr. Sutton, we'll turn it over to you, and if you'll go ahead and give a little brief bio on yourself and then take it over. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
And is the slide up?
It
Yes,
is
it
up.
is.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. For those who don't know me, I'm Diane Thumb. When I started with APHIS back in the early 1990s, I originally started at the Scrapie Investigation Center in Mission, Texas, where one of our primary projects was to understand whether embryo transfer would prevent the transmission of Scrapie. And it appears that it either prevented it or substantially reduces it. From there, I went on to a couple other APHIS posts, and then in 1998, at the start of the new rulemaking, I came back to the Scrapie program as the Scrapie program manager on the ruminant program staff. So I'm going to cover the Accelerated Scrapie program, which got its beginnings in 1998. Let's see if I can get the thing to, there we go. So in 1998, we did another advance notice of proposed rulemaking, which proposed to bring back the regulatory program and to proceed with accelerating the eradication of Scrapie from the United States. The key components of it, I'll go through on the next slide. I'm going to go ahead and give you a summary of what happened. So in 2000, as a result of the 201 trade action that Paul Rogers described, that was initiated by the industry, we were able to get an emergency declaration that came with $10 million in emergency funding that allowed us to kick off the program in 2000. And one of the major initiatives we did at that time was to evaluate the third eyelid test as a live animal test for Scrapie. That project was successful, but it was challenging and expensive to get the appropriate tissue from the third eyelid. It resulted in an 87% sensitivity in sheep over 14 months of age. We published, after we got comments from the advance notice of proposed rulemaking, we drafted a proposed rule, took comments on that, and we got over 100 comments on each of the items, giving suggestions on how best to implement the program. Both Dr. Detweiler and myself, along with a variety of state animal health officials. I don't remember if Jim was involved in that or not, but we put together the draft regulation. We published it for public comment, and then we made a lot of changes based on all the input that we received, and the final rule was published in September of 2001, kicking off the
I
program.
was involved in that, Diane, remember it well.
Very good. Your memory is better than mine, which is a good thing. So at that point, the key things that that we changed from what had been happening in the past was we made it mandatory identification of animals on change of ownership. And we did that through a process called consistent state status. So in order for a state to have a consistent state status, they had to have a rule requiring the identification of sheep on change of ownership and on dairy goats and purebred goats as well. There were some exceptions for goats at that time because Scrapie wasn't perceived to be as large a problem in goats back at that point. And we recognized that we were not going to find all of the Scrapie infected flocks without increasing our surveillance. So we conducted a preliminary study called the Scrapie Ovine Slaughter Surveillance Study from mid-2002 into 2003, in which we discovered that there was approximately 1 in 500 sheep infected with Scrapie in the United States, and that slaughter surveillance was an effective means of identifying infected animals. So we converted it to an ongoing surveillance program in 2003, which was called the Regulatory Scrapie Slaughter Surveillance Program. And what we do is we sample as many sheep and goats between the ages of 18 and 72 months of age at slaughter that we can. Also in 2003, we began utilizing live animal testing and the use of lymphoid tissue as part of our surveillance effort, which increased the testing of lymphoid tissue, increased the sensitivity of the test by about 24%. In 2004, at the urging of Michigan, we added genetic-based pilot projects to the regulation and began what became the genetic-based herd plans, which reduced the number of animals that had to be destroyed in flocks by 60% when we found an infected herds. We were only removing the genetically susceptible exposed animals after that point. We held a meeting in Riverdale, Maryland, where the USDA headquarters are, with the state veterinarians, researchers, and VS personnel, and came to the conclusion that we wanted to move forward to expand the individual state pilot projects into a national-based genetic herd cleanup plan. Then in 2019, we tweaked the final rule primarily to increase the traceability of goats by including all goats in the ID requirements and to give additional flexibility in how we conduct disease investigations. So as I alluded to, the primary components of what we did during that period of time was to provide a lot of education and prevention. We went to at least several meetings each year to update the industry and our state counterparts. We focused a lot on getting ID compliance at markets and other concentration points. We adopted surveillance both at slaughter, and we initiated voluntary on-farm surveillance, as well as testing all of the exposed animals that were depopulated so that we could better understand how the disease was moving within the herds. We also traced all the positive animals back to their herd of origin and also completed cleanup plans on those flocks, removing all the genetically susceptible exposed animals and testing exposed animals. Yeah. Oops, not sure why that happened. We also did what we called missing ewe investigations. If we couldn't find an exposed animal that was female and might have contaminated the herd in which they were residing, we would test using live animal rectal biopsy or third eyelid test the animals in those flocks in order to determine if the infection had been spread. And we actually found several herds in that manner that were positive. We switched over to rectal biopsy because it's much easier to collect that sample reliably. Has about the same sensitivity as the third eyelid, with one rectal biopsy is equivalent to doing 2 third eyelid biopsies. We also monitored previously infected and exposed flocks to make sure the disease did not recur in those flocks. Not sure why it keeps jumping, but we'll go back. And we found that reinfection of herds that had been cleaned up was very rare and was generally explained by the purchasing of genetically susceptible animals that had been exposed in other herds. We also continued to manage the scrapie-free flock certification program, and over the years upgraded the requirements to ensure that when a flock was certified as free, that it truly was free, And since we moved up to utilizing the higher standards, we have not had a Scrapie certified flock break with infection. So this just shows the success of the program over the years. As you can see, the disease was largely a disease in the black-faced meat sire breeds, Suffolk, Hampshire, and the like, but there was still a significant number of mottled and white-faced sheep affected. Just about every breed has had at least one case, unless the breed is very rare, in which case it's just a numbers game. I'd be happy to take any questions. I'm sorry, I guess we're waiting till the end for questions.
Dr. Sutton.
Go ahead.
One thing that occurs to me is we came a long, long ways in 20 years or 25, however you want to look at it. But I attribute a lot of that progress being made because it wasn't just the government, the federal government or state government working in a vacuum. It was everybody working together. And one thing that I haven't heard anything about yet this evening is the Scrapie Oversight Committee. Would you just briefly touch base on that a little bit?
Thank you for pointing that out. Yes, we have, since the inception of the Scrapie Free Flock Certification Program, we've had an oversight committee, which, especially in the early days, provided a lot of producer education, provided a lot of direction and guidance and ideas on how to improve the program, and provided a lot of general support for the program. So I would like to truly thank them. I'd also like to thank Jim and Paul and a whole bunch of industry producers and others who came to the table to talk about all the important issues of the Scrapie program and figure out solutions with us. This really could not have been done without a joint effort between the producers, the states, and USDA.
Diane?
Thanks, man. Are there other questions right now? We will have more opportunity for questions when these presentations are completed too, but I would entertain some questions for Dr. Sutton now, if there are any.
Jim, this is Paul. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, go ahead, Paul.
Okay. Well, I'd really like to thank Diane for hanging in there. I mean, this has been, and Linda, this has been, a long road, and we're getting there. And, there were days, weeks, months, years where it wasn't very pretty, but y'all did a good job.
Thanks.
And I'll echo that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll echo too, not me, but Diane. She's really hung in there. It's Linda, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if there aren't any other questions for Diane right now, the next thing on our agenda was going to be a presentation from Eric Mrozinski, who is a producer in Indiana. And Eric had an unforeseen event occur this afternoon, and he's not going to be able to be with us. He's fine, everybody's fine, but just unable to be on the webinar this evening. And so I'm going to take the opportunity. Eric was going to talk about the producer perspective from an experience with Scrapie and his flock. And since he can't join us, I want to just relate a couple of things briefly about what I have experienced having worked with producers who had Scrapie in their flocks and the impacts that it had on them. And I certainly can't do justice to this topic like Eric would have, but over the years as a practitioner, I had diagnosed Scrapie or been involved in some of the diagnoses in flocks in my practice area. And then as the state veterinarian of Wyoming for over 20 years, we had several flocks. It wasn't a huge number, but it was enough. One was enough, but we had 5 or 6, I think, over the 20 years. And again, back in the days when we had to depopulate those flocks, as opposed to just removing those genetically susceptible animals. And I can tell you that it had a very negative impact on those producers from an emotional perspective, but also it affected their flock finances, etc. And I would have to give all of those producers who I dealt with over the years a lot of credit for their cooperation with the industry and with the governments, both state and federal, in working with us to get through those processes. But anytime that you've got a flock that's affected, whether it's a purebred flock or just and I don't mean this to sound the way it may have sounded, but just a farm flock type of thing, whether they're purebred genetics or not, there's an emotional connection, well as, you know, the time taken to develop genetic strain, etc. I think the biggest issue is the emotional strain that a depopulation creates on a flock owner. But just a lot of financial and emotional impacts that you can't really even begin to understand that until you've been through it. So again, I can't do justice to what Eric would have been able to do for us on that topic, but I just wanted to bring that up because anybody that's been through that, either as a regulator, as a practitioner, or more importantly, as a producer, certainly knows that scrapie takes its toll on a flock owner. So with that, we'll introduce Dr. Stephanie Ringler. And Stephanie, again, if you'll basically introduce yourself and give a little bio, and then you'll go into the topic of where we are today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Stephanie Ringler. I work for the National Sheep and Goat team with Diane and Linda. I'm new to the team, but prior to that, I was a field veterinary medical officer with USDA APHIS. And so I've been working with USDA for about 8 years. I also have experience working with sheep and goats as I work with them in my community here in Pennsylvania. And I'm an AASRP emerging leader for 2023. So I've been doing a lot of sheep and goat work for the past 15 years, I would say, and I really love working with them. Today, I'm going to be talking about where we are today. So just give me a second to share my screen.
You've got it up there, Stephanie.
Great. All right, so I get the honor of showing where we are today. As you've heard from the other speakers this evening, there have been many years invested in eradicating scrapie from the US. Scientific advancements in diagnosis and surveillance, as well as program implementation for the past 30 years has shaped where the program is today. It's the efforts of hundreds of field employees from both state and federal staff, numerous sheep and goat organizations, industry partners, and the thousands of sheep and goat producers that we have accomplished so much for this program. The American sheep industry has helped the US get to the point that we can say today scrapie is nearly eradicated. And we're looking at efforts to further science and genetics and the overall health of our animals. Thank you for your continued service to the scrapie program and the hard work that you put into caring for your sheep every day. So I hope you really enjoy this presentation to see kind of where we are today. So achievements through surveillance, fiscal year 2023. So we'll start where we are today. And so far it's been very positive, and As you can see, since May 31st, 2023, we have collected over 15,000 sheep and goats from slaughter and over 1,000 animals on farm. These are really great numbers to look at, as this is a 7% increase from last year at the same time. We've been able to increase our sampling since last year through increased efforts from the field and external stakeholders. We've added several RSS sites in the past 4 months. We have found new routes for samples in parts of the country where numbers were low, and we are currently creating outreach materials for external stakeholders that will be translated into 8 languages. Here you can kind of see what type of sheep and goats are being collected so far this year. We see that we have a lot of white-faced sheep that are between the ages of 2 and 6 years old being collected in slaughter sites and on farm. And your achievements through surveillance are paying off, so thank you so much. This is through the years, 735,000 RSS samples collected since 2003. We've had 58,000 on-farm samples collected since 1999, and our last case of classical scrapie was found in fiscal year 2021, which means if we don't have another scrapie case, we will be eradicated from scrapie in the United States in 2028. And since this finding, we have tested over 60,000 animals for scrapie. So we can say, you know, when we got that positive result in 2021, we've tested 60,000 animals to show that no other animals had scrapie additionally. There are 44 out of the 50 US states are free of classical scrapie cases for greater than 7 years. Based off of this chart that I'm showing right here, 1 in 379 sheep sampled at slaughter in 2002 to 2003 were positive. So that was kind of our peak time. And since January 1st of 2021, which is where we had our last case, only 1 in 50,000 sheep sampled were positive on farm or slaughter. So that's huge gains there with not finding additional animals since then, if you look at it from 2021 to 2002. We've had over 1,600 flocks enrolled in the SFCP since 1992. We have over 90 RSS collection sites in the United States and 18 labs approved in the United States to test scrapie samples. In a project that we recently did, we found that over 70% of sheep genotypes from 2019 to 2022 were found to be resistant to scrapie. Right here shows the map of states free of classical scrapie cases greater than 7 years. So I'll just show this to you for a moment. And as you can see from this map, the brighter green, the darker green are states with cases of scrapie only in sheep in the last 7 fiscal years. And then in the states that have the lines, those are states with cases of scrapie in both sheep and goats in the last 7 fiscal years. And the ones in the solid color, the lighter green, are states free of scrapie cases for more than 7 years. And that's how we got the 44 out of 50 states. And then lastly, we do have ongoing research going on, and recently we had the RSS genotyping project, which started in 2018 as a pilot project to decrease the cost of scrapie IHC testing in a subset of submission by only testing those animals that are genetically susceptible to scrapie. And so through this program, over 13,000 sheep have been genotyped from 2019 to 2022. We're still in this genotyping project as well. And then we also have had the NOMS 2019 goat study. The goals for scrapie susceptibility and genotyping were to determine the prevalence of resistant genotypes in US goats and discern variations in prevalence among goat breeds. Again, I know we're in a sheep meeting today, but this did help advance the program and kind of understanding the genetics as a whole in not only sheep, but and in goats. That study had over 6,000 goats participate in it, which was a large number. And there have been many projects going on, but I just wanted to show two main ones. And then lastly, WOA is planning to open the scrapie chapter in the next year. And we have asked them to consider live animal testing and genotyping in their review. So thanks for having me today. That's all that I have.
Thank you, Dr. Ringler. I appreciate that information, and it's definitely encouraging to see the changes in those slaughter surveillance positives from the early 2000s until now. Obviously, we've come a long ways. And one thing I think before we move into the question and answer section of our evening, and we'll turn it back over to Jay here in just a minute. You mentioned the term classical scrapie, and I think it would be worthwhile to have either Dr. Ringler, Dr. Sutton, or Dr. Detweiler explain that term, perhaps, and differentiate it from the NOR 98 so it's clear to people what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me defer to Linda and Diane because I know that they have been dealing with this for many years, and especially Linda was at the first meeting in Norway for NOR 98. So you guys go ahead and explain further.
So Linda, if you want to talk about NOR 98, go ahead, and then I'll talk about how we address it as a policy matter.
Sounds good. All right. So NOR 98 was a strain of scrapie that was actually first discovered by the Norwegians, and the sample goes back to 1998. They actually announced it in 2003, but it was the lesions in the brain were the area of the brain that was affected was different than classical scrapie. The pattern on the Western blot, which I showed you a picture there, was a different thing. The clinical signs initially they thought might be different, but found that really, if you really looked at a number of cases, they were similar to classical scrapie signs. But the real difference in there, it's now a lot of work that's been done, a lot of not only epidemiology, but transmissibility studies, that it appears that the NOR 98 strain of scrapie is one that is, if it is naturally transmissible, it is very difficult to transmit. So flocks that have a case usually have only one case, and it's thought that it might be even a spontaneous disease or low. The other thing with the NOR 98 strain is, unlike with the classical that I told you, that most of the classical scrapie cases have the prion protein in the various lymphoreticular tissues, in other tissues where it can be shed into the environment. And that doesn't appear to be the case with NOR 98, or at least in levels that are enough to affect other animals. So now I said that the Norway found a 1998 case, but going back, the UK has identified cases even going back into the 80s. But again, it's more of a rare disease. Thought maybe it's spontaneous or at least very hard to transmit on a natural basis. The other thing that is really important to know with NOR 98 is the genotypes that affect. Like we were talking about with classical scrapie, right? The ARR sheep are like, it's more resistant, the Argentine homozygotes at 171. And that's not true for the atypical, the NOR 98 cases. So they do have cases in the ARR sheep and in the heterozygote sheep. In fact, more so than in some of the more susceptible, like the Valinine strain. So those are some of the scientific differences on there. Now the WOA, the World Organization for Animal Health, you can eliminate, because of the potential for sporadic cases, spontaneous, because Australia and New Zealand have both had atypical cases of scrapie found, that the chapter does not consider atypical scrapie. So as long as you're free of the classical scrapie, then you can be declared free of the disease. Dr. Sutton, did I cover as much as I should have here?
Yes, very good. Thank you. So the U.S. had our first case in the mid-2000s of Norm 98 scrapie, because we couldn't be sure that it was like exactly the same thing that they saw in Norway. We called it Nor 98 like scrapie. Others have called it atypical scrapie or non-classical scrapie. And so you may hear any of those terms used for it. When we've had our first couple of cases, we depopulated those herds in their entirety to better understand what was happening with the disease, whether or not it was spreading within the flocks or not. We found no additional cases, and after populating, I forget if it was 2 or 3 herds, we decided to stop depopulating those herds and just put them onto monitoring plans instead. And that's what we continued to do up until this day. So we're no longer depopulating those herds or quarantining those herds or restricting their movement. We're just requiring that any animals that die be sampled for scrapie testing, and that they apply ear tags to any animals not going to slaughter before they move them off the premises, consistent with the standard movement regulations.
Thank you for that explanation. And Jay, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to you to moderate questions and answers, please.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks to all of our speakers for all that information and the expertise here tonight. We did have a couple of questions come in while you were talking. One of them is, where are we in terms of export regulations for sheep based on our scrapie status?
Linda, you want to give some more details on what we're doing with WOA?
Sure. So we've been actually since 2016, and Dr. Sutton was real pushing on this. We've been asking the World Organization for Animal Health to update the chapter on scrapie, because right now, in order to really export and maintain your, if you get free status to maintain your freedom, that you have to export from, they call it establishments, which are really flocks or herds that have been free of scrapie, like kind of in our SFCP program for 7 years. And you can see that's really logistically challenging for any country to be able to do that and have large numbers export. So the United States has been asking the World Organization for Animal Health, WOA, in order to change the chapter and allow genetic-based exports as well, or live animal testing and/or live animal testing, in order for countries that have scrapie at a low level to be able to export. So we had some really good success this year. We were able to get WOA to raise a priority, to have the chapter to review to their top priority. So that looks like that's going to happen this year. And then just recently, we got the countries of the Americas, so 33 countries of the Americas, to sign a consensus statement to support what the United States has been asking for, and that's to export on based on genetics and use of live animal tests. So that should hopefully, we've asked them to form an ad hoc group to incorporate those scientific things into the chapter. So those are the things that we've done. Now, there are some countries that already have moved to that are allowing animals to come in based on genetics. I know Mexico has provisions for that. Canada has some provisions for that, and as well as accepting the SFCP, the flock certification. So there are countries that are already moving and allowing imports based with a genetic test. I don't know if that answers it adequately, but that's kind of the status right now. And we'll continue to work with WOA to try and advance that, to expand our exports.
Thank you, Linda. And if anybody has a follow-up to that, feel free to type your questions or a new question, type your questions into the question box, or if you prefer to just ask it verbally, just raise your hand and I can call on you and unmute you and you can ask it directly to our panelists here. And another question came in on how and where can we voluntarily submit samples. They have a hobby flock on the big island of Hawaii with mixed breeds, mixed face colors. Where can they get testing done?
Can I take this?
You are welcome to.
That's my job, is to try and get as many samples. I'm going to put a push in. So whoever wrote that, if they could either put in the chat, or Jay, I don't know how you get a hold of them. We'll hook them up with the people in Hawaii. All right, I promise. I'll get them hooked up with our folks in Hawaii to get in touch with them. And for anybody else on the call, we're really asking you, if you have, we really need to get up to 40,000, and because of like COVID and stuff, we've not. So we're asking you, if you have deads and dyings, if you have anything that might look like scrapie, please contact, your accredited veterinarian, your state veterinarian, your federal in your states. You can go on our website to get lists on there. So please, it's really important that we get. They're the ones that are on farm deads are our way to really make sure that we don't have any scrapie. And you can see as we push down and we get further away, it's important for us to find those last cases of scrapie. We don't want to go down and be at 6.5 years and find it. We want to, if we're going to find it, let's find it now, if we haven't gotten rid of it. So I'm really asking all you, and if you have contacts with slaughterhouses, we need those to get in and do more RSS. So that's my plea tonight. Thank you.
Linda, do you want to tell them kind of the benefits also? I mean, we have the tags and possibly.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks. So we no longer, you can get free tags. Thanks, Dr. Ringler. We no longer, so you can get free tags in your first time, but if you, we do have funding that if you volunteer and you submit an on-farm dead, or if you bring it into your state lab for necropsy, that you can get another issuance of free tags on there, another set of free tags. So that would be an incentive to do that. So again, you can go through your state and call in there, and then you can just ask them about your free tags. But from a national level, we do have money. So yeah, thanks. That's a good incentive on there. Some states too are offering necropsy service. We have some states that have built that program in where you can get your necropsy paid on there if you allow this, for the scrapie sampling. And maybe Dr. Sutton has some additional things you'd like to add.
Diane, I think you're
Got
muted.
myself muted. Yeah, I think you did an excellent job of covering it. For some reason, one of my webcams failed, so I had to figure out how to switch to the other one. So nothing to add. Very good.
What about live animal testing? Do you want to tell them a little bit about the rectal biopsy testing? And, sometimes we offer that as well.
Yeah, we can offer the rectal biopsy testing. That can be done. That's on a kind of a case-by-case basis, and that depends on the state. So if you would be interested in that, it would be with genotyping and the rectal biopsy. That would be the best to contact your state or federal officials in those states.
And we happen to have the state official on here. So let me see if I can find her and unmute her. And she has her contact information in here too. Ken, I will pass that, who asked the question, I will pass that along to you. And Dr. Kozula, if you were on, let's see, I just unmuted you. If you want to go ahead and speak. Yep.
Sure. Anyway, I'm the state VMO. I also kind of got voluntold or inherited the scrapie program, and I've been running it for the state of Hawaii for about 15 years. I'm on the Big Island, so whoever mentioned that or whatever, I thought I got everybody with our Hawaii Sheep and Goat Association, and they look at me going, I don't remember your name, but I remember you. You always give us your heads. So yes, by all means, please give out my contact information. This year, thankfully, we have made our sheep quota, but I'm always desperate for goats, particularly since with our ethnic population, they tend to be sold live and everything is eaten except for the back. So I did get one this weekend.
All right,
That's fantastic. Wow, that's great. Thanks. So we got Hawaii hooked up. Excellent.
yes, and I will pass your contact information along to our asker of the question, so you guys can connect. On the rectal samples question, do we have to have a vet collect the rectal sample?
Yes, yes. It has to, most of the time it's a state or federal veterinarian. It is a technique. It's not the easiest to do if you're first starting out, because if you don't get the right number of follicles, then it is an invalid test. So it's a specific area of where the rectal mucosa, the lining is. So yes, it has to be a veterinarian that collects that. We really, it's more regulatory vets that collect it, and we do it in conjunction with genotyping for sheep.
And we do it at no cost to the producer.
Okay, very good. And other than the testing, how do we identify scrapie in our flock, or if we might have scrapie? What are some of the things to look for?
Okay, so I'll jump in and anybody else can do that. So in my years in experience with the cases, a lot of times the owners will report this as some kind of change in temperament of the sheep. Sometimes they'll distance themselves, they'll become more hyper excitable. You know, it's something that they notice that's off. Then eventually that they may, so scrapie got its name from scraping and pruritus or itching, but I can tell you that many of the cases, in fact, probably the majority that I've seen in over my years, that a lot of times they don't have the itching. So just because you don't see the itching doesn't mean that it's not scrapie. So a lot of times they'll have tremor, especially the head and neck, and depending on your age, like I used to use Katharine Hepburn and somebody with Parkinson's, you know, or Michael J. Fox, but it looks like almost a tremor, like a Parkinsonian type of tremor. They will get then gait abnormalities, and this is usually progression. And it's usually sometimes can be weeks, even months, the progression of this, especially if you notice it early. But the progression, the way they walk. So usually there's a high step, a lot of times in the front limbs, a bunny hop in the back limbs, abnormal, they'll sway in their rear limbs, and eventually they'll become recumbent. Sometimes they'll stargaze, they look up, that's some of the things. They become hyper excitable to sound or to light, they go down and they can't get up. Now, times of stress will really make the signs worse. So lambing, even shearing. So sometimes shearers would tell us they would pick it up in flocks that were infected. And a lot of times it gets misdiagnosed. Sometimes it's neurologic diseases like listeria, but a lot of times if people miss, like you have a big flock and you might miss the subtle early signs, pregnancy toxemia is one that I've seen it get misdiagnosed as on there because of anybody else jump in on what you've seen? That's my kind of.
Dr. Detweiler, I would add to that one of your photos was a really good illustration of scrapie. One of the signs I've seen a lot of was just a chronic loss of condition. And then that photo that I'm referring to showed the wool loss, whether there's scraping or itching associated with it or not. A lot of times they'll just have patches of wool that are missing.
Yeah, that was my actually first case of scrapie I ever saw. It was in a flock in Ohio. That picture was from.
Yeah, and one of the it was in fact the first case of scrapie I ever saw, because I never saw one in veterinary school, but it was one of the premier flocks in Wyoming, a good scrapie flock, client of mine, and that ewe that was in the picture that you showed could have been the ewe that I saw that in, and I couldn't believe my eyes. I didn't, scrapie wasn't something you just typically diagnosed. It had to be on the differential diagnosis list, but it was pretty hard to believe that that's what I was actually seeing, but it's what it turned out to be. So one other thing I would mention too is that, and I think you, Diane, and Stephanie, and you, Linda, have all kind of stated this in one way, shape, or form, but as we progress towards the final stages of an eradication program, the final cases are very, very, very difficult to find. And that's why additional surveillance is so critical, because you've got to look like the dickens for a needle in a haystack, which is much different than what it was like back in even the 1980s or even in the early 2000s, where we had several cases out there. They weren't that hard to find. They were hard enough, but they weren't near as hard as what we're looking for now, is those last vestiges of the infected flocks. So we really need to continue to fund the surveillance efforts. Jay, is there anything else?
Yeah, a couple of points, and let me pick the most recent one on the traceability side of it, and scrapie tags versus EID tags. Question in general was, if they apply EID ear tags, is that enough to serve as adequate traceability for animals under 18 months?
840 RFID tags and implants that are approved for sheep and goats can be used as official ID in sheep and goats. We discourage you from using the cattle EID tags because most of them are too heavy to hold up in the softer sheep and goat ears, particularly the smaller or younger animals.
Okay, and then the other question we had was on processing facilities and testing sampling that goes on at processing facilities. The question was specific to Texas, but I'm going to generalize it just more, how do they know where the testing's going on, how widespread is that, randomized, just kind of a general overview of maybe how the samples are gathered from various processing facilities throughout the country.
So that's the RSS program on there. And what we ask is all the states, again, to try and get to the 40,000, one, for the states to meet the minimum, is to go to the plants, the slaughter plants, and be it federal inspected, state inspected, or even custom. We have some custom exempt plants that are on. Any place that does adult sheep and goats, that if we can get heads from them, either on we like it on a routine basis, like if you can get them to save so many heads, or we have our people going in, state or federal people going in and collecting. So, and there's all different aspects that you can collect. We have some plants that they don't use the heads, or their buyers don't eat the heads, so they'll put them in a barrel, and then we'll go in and test them. And so really important that we have the identification, the tags that stay in the ear, and they'll collect a part of the brain, the obex, and a retropharyngeal lymph node, and a piece of cerebellum. Those are the key on those. We have other plants that they do use a head, so it might be where you collect on the line. There's all different variations, but the plants that we like to collect from, and we are encouraging as many plants as we can get, and we do have the funding to do that, so that we would find anything to get on board and to set up a routine collection. And if somebody from Texas asked us on there, if you know of plants, we really could use some more plants in Texas that would be willing. I don't know if it was a state or federal person, because they know that that's been an issue, or if it's somebody in the producer, et cetera. That would be really good to get some more Texas plants on.
And Linda, just an additional comment to make is, if you are a producer in Texas and you know your animals are going to like Minnesota to be slaughtered, you can give us a heads up and we can send the staff to go take those samples. And if you did give us samples, again, you could get the free tags if we can, you give us that heads up. Also, not only, slaughter facilities, you could also look at if you're a dealer hauler and, maybe you're taking animals from one place to another and you have deads every once in a while, you can also enter in an agreement with us and we can pay you money for those heads. Or if you're an accredited veterinarian and you're working on farms and you have animals, that are dying from a sheep farm, we also can pay you for those samples, like $10 a head or $5 a head. So there's many different avenues.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Ringler. Quick question on microchips. Somebody mentioned that some of the small flock owners are using dog and cat microchips, or are they logged as unique ID like the Harper Livestock Injectable 840 chips? Any comments on that?
They do not count as official ID for movement of sheep and goats.
Okay.
You need, unless you applied a chip before, I think it was 2011. We grandfathered, I think, everything back to was it 2011 or 2015. But anyway, if you're currently applying chips, they need to be the 840 sheep and goat chips.
Okay.
Avid has approved chips, as well as Alliance ID. Yeah, and I think there's one other company. You can find the list of all the suppliers on our website. Also on our website, you can view videos of sheep and goats with scrapie if you'd like to do so. And the thing to remember is the most common sign of scrapie is incoordination, otherwise known as ataxia. So stumbling, falling down.
So does the same thing apply to EID tags, the old ones that were like 940 or had the manufacturing number on it, that those aren't official?
Right, manufacturer ID is not official for US born sheep and goats. There is a small exception that's been created for imported animals where they can't use the 840 chips, but that's a rare circumstance.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Sutton. So I think we're running up against our time limit. We did have one question come in that I'll just kind of give everybody a few minutes to comment on. And Jim,
Jay, I'm going to interrupt for just a second. You have two people with their hands up.
oh, where are you at? I didn't see them.
Under the attendees, Rich Dumbs and Jean Edmiston.
Let me find them here.
At the very top, I believe.
They are not showing up on mine, but I can find them. All right, Jean, I'm going to go to you first. That's okay with you?
You're on. So I was the one that asked the question about the Texas inspected processing. So I use on a monthly basis a ethnic processor, and it's Texas inspected, not USDA. For me to have them collect whatever's necessary, I assume I have to do that, or does the inspector just randomly within that facility just randomly pull out heads and collect them and then send them into some testing facility? How does that actually work?
Yeah, so if that facility was on a systematic collection with us, they could either randomly or any kill in the day. It just depends on what was set up with the plant. And that's usually set up by we have these agreements set up with the plant. Or if you would like, to make sure that your animals got tested, you would let the state or federal official. And I would like, if it's okay with you, to get contact information and we can maybe connect and I can connect you with some of the folks in Texas. If the place that you get yours with slaughter that we could collect there. I think right now we just have one facility that's primary the collection from Texas are coming from. So we are always looking for more if you'd be amenable to that.
Okay, sure. So I had a couple of other questions in regards to it. If my customers take the heads, is that going to cause any problem, for my customers, assuming one of these animals actually had a case? If those heads are consumed, through their food preparation, is that going to impact, the human person?
Yeah, so we have over 300 years of epidemiology and different work that's been done with scrapie with no, unlike mad cow disease, unlike BSE, that there was not a zoonotic risk, a human risk.
And then one more question. What is the age range? Is it 18 months or is it 12 months on the scrapie tags of age?
Oh, 18 months, I'm sorry. Well, depends on it. Diane, do you want to add? It depends on how you're moving them, in slaughter channels or weathers or.
If you're moving lambs direct to slaughter, they don't have to be ear tagged if they're under 18 months. If you're moving them for unrestricted sale through a livestock market, then they need an ear tag unless they are wethers.
Okay, thank you.
And Gina will pass along Dr. Detweiler's email address for you, and you can get in contact with her.
Yeah, I'll put my contact in the.
I see that. Okay, thank you. So I think at this point, we'll just wrap up with some parting comments from each of you. I always get the question of why should producers care so much about what's going on with this? They always have 100,000 things going on and wonder why they should get excited about this. And you think about where we're at and where we've come from. What are some things that producers should think about and in the coming years, good signs to come, and why is this so important for the industry? And just your first thoughts. Who'd like to go first?
Jay, this is Paul Rogers.
Oh, Paul, there we go. All right, good to hear you.
Hey, I have one question for anybody who wants to answer it. It doesn't have to be now. It can be later. Is there any surveillance done on bison and cervids, particularly those that are farm raised, for TSEs?
We have the CWD herd certification program, in which probably 30 to 50% of the domestic cervid producers participate, and they have to test all animals over 12 months of age that die. We don't have a program specific to bison. If they do display signs typical of BSE, they could be sampled and tested for that program.
Thanks, Diane.
You're welcome.
Okay, so parting comments. Dr. Sutton, you like to go first?
So parting comments, as many of my colleagues have said, this is a state industry federal cooperative program that's been as successful as it has because of the hard work of every leg of that stool that Linda referenced, particularly the producers. Without Paul Rogers, this program never would have gotten off the ground, along with a large number of others who were instrumental. But because I'm getting old, I can't remember everybody's name. So thank you. I truly, truly appreciate you. The reason it's important now to focus on scrapie is we're at that cusp where we can either finish and get the job done, get to freedom, and not have to deal with this disease hopefully ever again, or we can fall back off that cliff into the morass of more and more and more scrapie as the years go by and the disease spreads. So let's get the job done. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate your help.
Thank you, Dr. Sutton. I'm just going in reverse alphabetical order. So Dr. Ringler, you're next.
Okay, thanks. No, everything that everyone, Linda and Diana have said today, I completely agree with, and I just appreciate being here tonight. Again, I'm newer to the team, but I hope to also give more to the scrapie industry, and I hope to be back here at ASI again.
Thank you. Dr. Detweiler?
I don't know what more I can add from what Diane had said, just to thank the industry and over the years, and hopefully everybody see how far we really truly have come. And it's really amazing. And I also want to reiterate, ASI has been instrumental. Their willingness, and Paul, especially over the years, to go and to Congress and to keep really making sure we get funded in the program with USDA stays forefront. So thank you. And thanks everybody out there that's worked so hard.
Thank you very much. And Paul, I know you're on. Do you have anything else to add? For any comments?
Oh, just one thing, Jay. Industry government partnerships are talked about a lot. And some of them work and some of them don't. This one has worked and it's really been good. It has, you know, from the states, the federal to the industry. It's really been a good deal. And thank all of you all. You all participated in it. And, you know, I'm not representing the industry anymore professionally, but I am a sheep and goat and cattle producer, so I've got a stake in this deal. So thank you all very much. It's been a good deal.
Thanks, Paul. And with that, Dr. Logan, I'll turn it over to you for the final word, and just leave everybody with the reminder that you'll get a follow-up email with a link to the recording, and express my appreciation for everybody's presentations and expertise tonight. So Dr. Logan, you get the final word tonight.
Well, thank you, Jay. It's different than when I'm talking with my wife, I guess.
I thought you would appreciate that.
Anyway, why should producers care about this? Why should they be interested in it? Mainly your flock health, but also your marketability. And I think that's the main reason for most of these eradication programs, is to maintain our marketability, both locally, interstate, internationally. It's very, very important to our marketability. So I just want to thank all of our panelists, and I want to thank all the people that participated tonight, especially those that asked the questions, because that helps forward the information that people need to hear about. So we really appreciate everybody being on. Appreciate you, Jay, being the moderator, and I appreciate Amy and Linda for, again, conceiving the idea for the webinar, and everybody for participating. So thank you very much.